The Honourable Damien O'Connor in reply.
In reply, Mr Speaker, thank you for the opportunity, and I appreciate those members who have contributed to this bill, the Underground Coal Mining Safety Bill. Mr Speaker, this was my best attempt to react and to take action from the Royal Commission report from the Pike River Inquiry. And it said, as one of its first things to do, was major change required and fast. I drafted a bill. The only avenue available to me was through the members' bill process, and I put this bill in there. Unfortunately, it took some time to be pulled out. In the meantime, Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that the government took the recommendations and developed changes to the mining regulations and legislation, and then promised to move on health and safety, Mr Speaker. There are 29 families who will remind each and every one of us of the failings of Parliament and the failings of legislation to put in place proper protection for their loved ones in underground coal mining, Mr Speaker. About 2 months prior to the Pike River disaster, Mr Speaker, having written to the Minister of Labour at the time, warning her about conditions in the coal mining industry, I received a reply, quote, "I am advised by the Department of Labour that there is no recent change in the pattern of mining serious harm notifications that might give cause for concern." Mr Speaker, that Minister has long gone. But what I have heard from the government in this debate is the same naive approach to health and safety, to mining regulations that minister had swallowed also. Because, Mr Speaker, in the process of development of the legislation that has been passed now for underground mine safety, the quarrying industry lobbied to be excluded, even though it's acknowledged as being a high-risk industry. And now this Parliament will be reminded by three other families who have lost loved ones in the short space, in fact, in this year alone, in the quarrying sector, that they wanted their loved ones to return home from work as well. And the legislation and the absence of regulation for quarrying meant that those workers were not protected. Mr Speaker, Scott Baldwin, Tane Hill Ormsby and Murray Taylor have been killed in their workplace, Mr Speaker, because the national government was lobbied to make changes to the proposals from the Pike River disaster and recommendations from the Royal Commission and dumb down that legislation. Mr Speaker, what I say in the House here, that the government has made changes to underground mining regulations and safety and made some improvements. But they've also made compromises as well. And what I ask through this legislation is that the government would support it to select a committee to enable us to review the progress that has been made and to ask the question whether we need to make further changes. Mr Speaker, at the moment, the wider body of health and safety legislation, Mr Speaker, has been parked up because the government's subject to lobbying. And in the same way, there may be families in the future who have every right to come to this House and say, "You failed my partner, you failed my husband," not you, Mr Speaker, but this House, because we ignored the wisdom before us and through lobbying, dumbed down legislation and didn't have in place the proper protection for people at work. Mr Speaker, this bill is a legitimate way of having a comprehensive review. I acknowledge the Green Party and New Zealand First for their support. They too see the wisdom. They have, and I'd like to acknowledge my West Coast colleague Kevin Hay, who has always stood beside me in trying to force the government into a better space on health and safety legislation. Mr Speaker, the 92 legislation and the regime was based on a flawed philosophy, but this government's oversight is based on flawed information. And so too, we face a situation where, because of lobbying, because of bad information, this national government is going to vote down this piece of legislation. This is a lost opportunity that would have allowed us to review the progress that we should be making in mining, quarrying and workplace health and safety.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary opinion will say no. The noes have it. Party votes called for. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
59 opposed.
New Zealand Labour.
32 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
12 votes in favour.
Māori Party.
2 in favour.
Act New Zealand.
1 opposed.
United Future.
1 opposed.
The ayes are 60, the noes are 61. The bill is not read a first time.